We live in a world where going to the toilet is a private thing. Our bathrooms have doors that lock. We use clean water to flush. The waste goes away, out of sight and out of mind. Medieval people did not have this. Their world was very different. The places they used for waste were not like ours. They were often much more public. Even the ones inside homes had public effects. The idea of privacy then was not the same. The idea of staying clean was not the same either. When we ask if medieval toilets were public, it is not a simple yes or no answer. The word public itself meant different things back then. Today, a public toilet is a specific room or building anyone can use. It is a shared facility. In the Middle Ages, public could mean many things. It could mean out in the open. It could mean used by many people. It could also mean that waste, even from a private place, affected everyone nearby. Imagine a medieval town or city. The streets were not smooth and clean. They were made of dirt, often muddy, and usually filled with all sorts of trash. Animals like pigs and dogs walked freely, people threw waste out of windows. Human waste was a part of this common scene. It was just how things were. This shared, often messy, environment made everything feel more public. Even personal bodily functions became public in their outcomes. The medieval period stretched for a long time, from about the year 500 to 1500. That is 1,000 years. Things changed a lot during these centuries. Early medieval times were different from the late medieval period. Life in a small village was not like life in a big city, such as London or Paris. What a wealthy lord did was not what a poor peasant did. So, when we talk about medieval toilets, we need to think broadly. We need to consider many different kinds of places. We need to think about different people. We need to remember that practices changed over time. But one thing stayed fairly constant: managing human waste was a problem for the whole community. It was not just a problem for one person. The bad smells, the unpleasant sights, the diseases, these were experiences everyone shared. They were public problems that touched every life. Let's think about a castle. A castle was a very large building. Many people lived there. The lord, his family, knights, servants, soldiers, and many others. All these people needed to relieve themselves. Castles had what are called garderobes. These were small rooms, usually just big enough for one person. They often jutted out from the castle wall. Inside, there was a seat or a hole in the floor. The waste dropped straight down. It would fall into the moat below, or into a large pit called a cesspit. Was using a garderobe a private act? Yes, in a way. You could close a door or hang a curtain. You were out of sight, but the waste itself was not truly contained. It did not just disappear. It became part of the environment right outside the castle walls. Anyone near the moat would smell it. Anyone who looked at the moat might see it. So, while the act itself might have some privacy, the consequences were very public. The waste affected the air, it affected the water, it affected the ground around the entire fortress. It was a constant public presence. Monasteries, where monks and nuns lived, also had specific ways of handling waste. Monks lived in a close community. They often had large communal latrines. These were long buildings. They had many wooden seats lined up side by side, often over a flowing stream or a very large pit. Everyone used these together. There was very little privacy in such a place. The sounds, the smells, and the presence of other people were all part of the daily routine. These monastic toilets were clearly public in how they were used and experienced. They were shared spaces for a necessary biological function. In towns and cities, the situation was even more varied. Wealthy homes might have a small privy. This was a simple wooden shed, often in the backyard, built over a pit. Or they might use chamber pots inside their rooms. Servants were usually responsible for emptying these pots. They would often empty them into a larger cesspit or simply into the street. Poorer homes had fewer options. They often relied entirely on chamber pots. People would then dump the contents out of windows or directly into the street gutters. The street itself effectively became a kind of public toilet, especially at night when the light was poor. Town authorities tried to control this. Local councils passed laws. They told people not to throw waste into the streets. But these rules were very hard to enforce. There were no organized waste collection services like we have today. People had to get rid of their waste somehow. The easiest, most convenient way was often the most public way, simply disposing of it outside. So, when we think about what public meant for medieval toilets, we need to consider shared spaces. We need to think about shared consequences. We need to think about shared sensory experiences. The strong, unpleasant smell of human waste was a common part of living in a medieval town or city. It was public in the most direct sense. It hung in the air, it was seen on the streets. It affected everyone, whether they were rich or poor. It was impossible to avoid completely. This is our starting point. We cannot look at medieval toilets and sanitation with our modern ideas. We have to try to understand their world. It was a world where personal actions often had very public results. A world where cleanliness was understood differently. A world where waste was almost always nearby, a constant feature of the landscape and the senses. The discussions ahead will go into these ideas more deeply. We will look at specific examples of these spaces. We will talk about what it must have felt like to live in such a world. We will talk about how medieval society managed or failed to manage all this waste. But the most important thing to remember is this: in the Middle Ages, waste was a collective problem. It was a public issue, whether it came from a private room or a large communal latrine. The clear lines we draw today between public and private were much blurrier then, especially when it came to human waste. It was a shared burden, shared smell, and shared health risk for all. Medieval life was full of shared spaces. Castles, monasteries, markets, streets, these were the main hubs of daily life, and where people gathered, waste followed. How these places handled human waste tells us a lot about what public meant for toilets then. Let's start with castles. These were not just homes for a lord, they were military centers, administrative hubs, and often small towns in themselves. Many people lived and worked inside a castle's walls. As we touched on, garderobes were the main solution. A garderobe was a small room. It had a hole. The waste fell down. Often, it fell into the moat. Imagine the moat around a castle. It was meant for defense. It was a barrier. But it also became a giant open sewer. The waste from many garderobes, from many people, all emptied into it. The water in the moat would be thick with human waste, food scraps, and other rubbish. The smell must have been constant. It would hang in the air around the castle. Anyone approaching the castle would notice it. Soldiers guarding the walls would live with it. This was a very public consequence. The moat, a defensive feature, also served as a very visible and very smelly public waste dump. Sometimes garderobes emptied into a cesspit. A cesspit was a deep hole dug into the ground. It was usually lined with stone or brick. It collected the waste. These cesspits were often located near the castle walls. When they filled up, they had to be emptied. This job fell to specific workers. They were called gong farmers in England. This was a dirty, dangerous, and very public task. These workers often worked at night. They would dig out the waste, then they would carry it away. This waste would be taken outside the castle walls. It was often dumped into fields or rivers, so even waste from a private garderobe eventually became public waste. It was moved through public spaces by public workers and often ended up in public waterways or land. Monasteries were another kind of public space. Monks lived a communal life. They ate together, prayed together, and often slept in shared dormitories. Their sanitation reflected this communal lifestyle. Monasteries often had large, sophisticated latrine blocks. These were sometimes called necessaria. They could be long buildings with dozens of seats. These seats were usually made of wood. They were often arranged side by side with no partitions. These monastic latrines were often built over a flowing stream or river. The stream would carry the waste away. This was a smart design for its time, but it meant the river downstream carried all the monastery's waste. Any village or town further down the river would then receive this waste. They would use the same river for drinking, washing, and fishing. So the monks' communal functional system had a very public and widespread impact. It affected everyone living along that waterway. Even when not over a stream, monastic latrines were very public within the monastery. Imagine the noise, the smell, the simple lack of personal space. Monks sat next to each other, performing a very private bodily function. It was a shared experience, a public part of their daily life together. This was not about privacy. It was about practicality and communal living. Beyond castles and monasteries, what about towns and cities? These were the most truly public spaces. Most people did not have private toilets in their homes. Even if they had a chamber pot, its contents usually ended up outside. Streets were the most common public dumping ground. People would simply throw the contents of their chamber pots out the window. Gardy-loo was a cry used in some places, particularly Scotland, to warn passers-by below. It comes from the French gardy-loo, meaning watch out for the water. This was not just water. It was human waste. It splattered onto the street, onto walls, onto people sometimes. The street gutters then became open sewers. Rain would wash some of it away, but often it just collected. Think of the stench. Think of the filth. People walked through this every day. Children played in it. The animals foraged in it. This was an undeniable public experience of human waste. It was everywhere. So it was unavoidable. It defined the sensory landscape of a medieval town. Public latrines did exist in some larger towns. These were rare but important. They were usually simple structures, often just a shed over a large pit. They were for anyone to use. They were often found near markets or busy public areas. These were the closest thing to what we call public toilets today, but they were still very basic. They were not regularly cleaned. They were often foul-smelling and dirty. They served a need, but not with any modern sense of hygiene. Markets themselves were incredibly public. Food was sold there. Animals were often slaughtered there, and people needed to relieve themselves. While specific latrines might be nearby, often people would just find a quiet corner. Or they would use a nearby alley. The market grounds would become soiled. This added to the general filth. The smells of food, animals, and human waste all mingled together. It was a powerful, very public sensory experience. Even the rivers that ran through cities became public sewers. People used them for drinking, for washing clothes, for bathing, and for getting rid of waste. All types of waste. The waste from privies emptied directly into the river. The waste carried by street gutters flowed into the river. The waste from slaughterhouses and tanneries also went into the river, so the vital waterways became heavily polluted. This affected everyone who drank from the river, everyone who lived near it, everyone who wanted to use it for travel. It was a public health disaster in waiting. In these medieval public spaces, the idea of privacy around human waste barely existed. The focus was on removal, often by the easiest and most direct means. This usually meant moving it into another public space: the moat, the river, the street, the cesspit. The consequences were always public: the smell, the sight, the risk of disease. There were laws trying to control this. Town charters often included rules about keeping streets clean. People were fined for dumping waste. But enforcement was hard. There was no real infrastructure for waste collection. There were no garbage trucks, no sewer systems. People had limited options. The easiest option was often to just put it outside. And outside was, by its very nature, public. So when we consider medieval toilets and public spaces, we see a strong connection. The design of castles and monasteries pushed waste into the common environment. The daily life of towns meant waste was constantly released into shared areas. Whether it was the communal latrine of a monastery, the waste-filled moat of a castle, or the foul-smelling streets of a city, human waste was a very public issue. It was a constant presence in the sensory and social landscape of medieval life. It shaped how people moved, how they smelled, and how they lived together. The next part will look at how private acts still created public problems. Even when medieval people sought a moment of privacy for their bodily needs, the waste almost always became a public problem. The line between a private act and its public consequence was very thin. This section looks at how seemingly private methods of waste disposal still spread filth and disease throughout the community. Let's start with homes. Most ordinary homes in towns and villages did not have dedicated latrines. They were too small, they were too simple. People living there relied on very basic solutions. The most common was the chamber pot. This was a simple ceramic or wooden pot. People used it inside their homes, usually in their sleeping chambers. Using a chamber pot was a private act. You could use it in your room, behind a curtain, or at night. But what happened next? The pot had to be emptied. For many, the easiest solution was to simply open a window and dump the contents into the street below. This was a common practice. We already touched on it, but it's important to stress this as a private act leading directly to a public problem. Imagine the scene. A person quietly uses their chamber pot inside. Then they carry it to the window. They empty it, the waste splashes onto the street, joining the mud, the animal waste, the other garbage. This happened day and night. The street was the common ground for everyone. It was where people walked, where children played, where tradesmen set up stalls. Now, it was also a receptacle for human waste from countless private homes. This was not just about smell and sight. This was about health. The waste carried diseases. When it was on the street, it was walked through. It was picked up by animals, it dried and became dust, then was breathed in. Flies landed on it. Then the flies landed on food. So, a private act of emptying a chamber pot directly contributed to public health risks for the entire community. It turned the common areas into breeding grounds for illness. Some wealthier homes might have had a privy. This was a small, usually wooden outhouse in the backyard. It would be built over a pit, a cesspit. This was more private than a chamber pot emptied into the street. You went into your backyard. You had a dedicated space. But again, the waste did not just vanish, it collected in the cesspit. Cesspits were dug deep into the ground. They were often lined to prevent the waste from seeping out too quickly, but they were not watertight. Over time, the liquid waste would seep into the surrounding soil. This was a problem for groundwater. Many homes relied on wells for their drinking water. If a cesspit was too close to a well, the seepage could contaminate the well water. So, even a backyard privy, a seemingly private solution, could poison the shared water supply. This made a private waste problem a public health crisis for neighbors. When cesspits filled up, they had to be emptied. This was the job of gong farmers or night soil men. This was a very public act. These workers would come at night. They would dig out the foul-smelling waste. They would, transport it through the streets. Sometimes they used carts. Sometimes they carried it in buckets. The smell would be immense. The sight, even in darkness, would be disturbing. This waste was then usually dumped outside the town walls, often into a river or onto open land. So, the waste from a private privy, once collected, became a very public spectacle and a public environmental burden. Even inside larger houses, like manor houses or the private chambers of a lord, sanitation had public impacts. While a lord might have a private garderobe in his bedchamber, the waste still fell into the moat or a cesspit. This was the same as in a castle. The lord's personal waste became part of the broader public problem of waste management for the entire estate. Consider the role of servants. Servants were crucial in managing waste from private spaces. They emptied chamber pots, they cleaned privies, they carried waste. This work was dirty. It was unpleasant, and it was highly visible. A servant carrying a full chamber pot or a bucket of waste through a household or courtyard was not a private act. It was a public display of the unpleasant realities of waste management. Their daily tasks made the private mess a public performance. For the poor, privacy was even less of an option. They might share a single room with many family members. A chamber pot would be used right there. Its emptying would be a hurried, necessary public act. Or they might not even have a chamber pot. They would simply use the street, a back alley, or an open field as their toilet. This was an entirely public act of defecation. This was not about choice. It was about necessity. The constant presence of waste from private sources created a general atmosphere. It was a background condition of medieval life. The smell of decay and human waste was ever present. It was in the air of towns. It clung to clothes. It was tracked into homes. It seeped into the ground. This made the entire urban environment feel like a giant, semi-public toilet. Even if you kept your own home clean, the world outside was not. And that world outside inevitably seeped in. The lack of proper sewage systems meant that water was also a public problem. The rainwater would wash street waste into rivers and streams. These were the same rivers and streams used for drinking water, for washing, for cooking. So, every individual act of dumping waste, no matter how private its origin, contributed to the pollution of public waterways. This pollution impacted everyone's health. It impacted the taste of their water. It impacted the fish they ate. In essence, medieval people lived in a world where waste could not be truly contained or made truly private. Every solution, from the most basic chamber pot to the more elaborate garderobe or privy, ultimately led to waste entering shared spaces. These spaces included the streets, the rivers, the air, and the groundwater. The consequence was a public sensory assault and a public health crisis. The idea that you could simply dispose of your personal waste without it affecting the wider community was alien. Personal waste was always, in its final destination and its effects, a public burden. It was a constant reminder that for medieval people, personal hygiene and public health were deeply, if unpleasantly, intertwined. To really understand medieval toilets, we have to use our senses. It was not just about where the waste went. It was about what it felt like to live in a world where waste was always present. This part explores the sights, sounds, and especially the smells that defined the medieval experience of sanitation. First, the smell. This is perhaps the most important sense. Imagine a medieval town. There was no modern plumbing, no garbage collection, human waste, animal waste, rotting food, industrial waste. It was all mixed together. The air must have been thick with it. The smell of human waste was everywhere. It came from the streets where chamber pots were emptied. It came from the privies in backyards. It seeped out of cesspits. It rose from moats around castles. It drifted between latrines and monasteries. It was a constant, pervasive odor. This was not a faint smell. It would have been strong, accurate, and inescapable. People lived with this smell every day. They were likely desensitized to some extent. It was their normal. But it would still be a background hum of unpleasantness. When the weather was warm, the smell would be worse. When it rained, the waste would churn and create new odors. The smell would cling to clothes. It would be in people's hair, it would be in their homes. It permeated everything. This constant smell affected social interactions. Imagine trying to conduct business in a market square filled with the stench of human and animal waste. Imagine eating a meal in a house where the street smell drifted in. It made everything harder. It was a constant reminder of the lack of hygiene. It was a daily assault on the senses. Then there was the sight. The streets were not just smelly, they were visibly dirty. Human feces would be mixed with mud, straw, animal droppings, and other garbage. But it was a common sight to see waste on the ground. People walked through it, animals walked through it. It was tracked everywhere. Moats around castles filled with waste would be a visual mess. Rivers flowing through towns, thick with effluent, would be visibly polluted. This was not hidden. It was there for all to see. It was a visual confirmation of the sanitation problem. It affected the aesthetics of the entire environment. There was no clean separation. The waste was part of the landscape. Consider the interior of places too. Even if a chamber pot was quickly emptied, the area might not be truly clean. There would be splashes, there would be residue, flies would be drawn to these areas. The overall level of visible cleanliness in most medieval living spaces would have been much lower than what we expect today. And the sounds. This is something we rarely think about. In communal latrines, especially in monasteries, there would be the sounds of people relieving themselves. The sounds of bodily functions, the splash of waste into water or a pit. These were not private sounds. They were shared. In towns, the sounds would be different. The warnings of Gardy-Loo before emptying a chamber pot from a window. The sloshing sound of waste hitting the street below. The calls of gong farmers working at night emptying cesspits. The sound of carts rumbling through streets carrying away refuse. These were all part of the auditory landscape. They were reminders of the constant process of waste creation and disposal. The presence of flies and other insects would also add to the sensory experience. Flies buzzing around waste, roaches scuttling in dirty corners, rats scurrying through garbage heaps. These animals were attracted to the filth. They were part of the visual and auditory environment. They were also carriers of disease, further linking the sensory experience to health risks. The sensory experience of medieval toilets was harsh. It was a constant reminder of the physical realities of life. It was a world of omnipresent smells, visible filth, and the sounds of unglamorous necessity. This constant assault on the senses was not just unpleasant, it had profound impacts. It impacted health. Disease spread quickly in such environments. Cholera, dysentery, typhoid, these were common. They were directly linked to contaminated water and food, and the general lack of hygiene. The sensory experience of waste was often a precursor to illness. It impacted social norms. How did people interact in such an environment? How did they eat? How did they raise children? It likely fostered a certain hardiness, a different tolerance for what we would consider unacceptable conditions. It made people adaptable. They had to be. It shaped their worldview. The body was seen differently. Its functions were more openly acknowledged because they were constantly observed, smelled, and heard. The idea of a completely private body and its functions was not as strong. The messiness of life was a given. Right? This deep sensory experience was part of what made medieval toilets public. Even if a person was alone in a garderobe, the waste it produced contributed to the overall sensory environment of the castle. Even if a chamber pot was used inside, its contents contributed to the smell and sight of the street. The effects were felt by all. This collective sensory experience meant that sanitation was never just an individual problem. It was always a community burden. The stench of a town, the sight of its soiled streets, the sounds of waste disposal, these were shared realities. They forged a common, if unpleasant, bond among its inhabitants. Everyone literally breathed the same air, an air often thick with the odors of human existence. This constant public sensory input was a fundamental aspect of medieval life, and it starkly highlights the differences between their world and ours. Access to sanitation, or lack thereof, in the Middle Ages was tied closely to a person's social status. It was not just about where people went, it was about who had what options, who dealt with the waste, and how sanitation reflected the strict hierarchies of the time. The social dynamics around medieval toilets were complex. At the very top were the nobility and wealthy merchants. They had the most options, though. Even their solutions were primitive by our standards. A lord in his castle or a rich merchant in his large townhouse might have a garderobe. This was a private room. It offered a degree of personal privacy that others did not have. It was a mark of status. To have a dedicated space, even a simple one, for such a personal function was a luxury. But As we have seen, even a lord's garderobe had public consequences. Its waste still impacted the moat or the cesspit. The emptying of a cesspit was a public task, so, while the act might be private, the disposal was part of a larger public system. The lord might not see or smell his own waste after it dropped, but the servants and those living outside the castle walls certainly did. Now, monasteries offered communal latrines for monks and nuns who had chosen a life of shared spiritual practice. This communal approach to bodily functions fit their lifestyle. It was egalitarian within the monastic order. Everyone, from the abbot down to the newest novice, used the same facility. This reflected their shared commitment to a simple, unadorned life. However, the waste from these large communal latrines still affected the wider public, usually downstream rivers or nearby fields. In towns and cities, social status dictated access even more clearly. Wealthy citizens could afford privies in their backyards. These were simple wooden structures over a pit. It was not fancy, but it was a step up from a chamber pot. It was dedicated. It was personal space, even if basic. This was a privilege. The waste from these privies still had to be emptied by gong farmers, a public and messy process. But the daily act was more private. For the vast majority of people, the urban poor, the artisans, the laborers, the peasants' options were limited. A chamber pot was the most common toilet, and its emptying was a public act, often out a window into the street. For many, especially those in very poor conditions or in rural areas, there were no dedicated facilities at all. The street, the alleyway, the field, or the nearest river became their toilet. This was an entirely public act. This lack of private space for bodily functions was a clear indicator of low social standing. Think about the sheer indignity. To have no choice but to expose yourself, however briefly, in a public space to relieve yourself. This would have been common for the poorest. It highlights a huge social divide. The rich had some semblance of privacy. The poor had none. Then there were the specialized workers who handled waste. The gong farmers, the scavengers, the cesspit emptiers. These were jobs that no one wanted. They were dirty, dangerous, and carried immense social stigma. These workers were essential for the urban environment. They literally cleaned up the waste of society, but they were often marginalized and looked down upon. Their very existence underscored the public nature of waste. They were the visible agents managing the community's collective filth. The waste itself had different social values. Royal waste might be handled with a little more discretion, perhaps in a well-located garderobe. But peasant waste was simply part of the street. This difference in treatment, or lack thereof, reveals how society viewed different classes. The waste of the rich was still waste, but its immediate disposal was handled with more resources. The waste of the poor was just a part of the public landscape. Disease was another social equalizer, but also a magnifier of social differences. While sanitation-related diseases like plague, dysentery, and cholera could affect anyone, the poor were often hit hardest. They lived in the most crowded, unsanitary conditions. Their access to clean water was often worse. Their bodies were weaker from poor nutrition. So, while the public health consequences of poor sanitation affected all, the burden of illness often fell most heavily on the lower classes. Over time, some towns tried to improve things. They built public latrines. They tried to create better systems for drainage. But these efforts were often slow, they were often inadequate, they were usually reactive, responding to major outbreaks of disease. These attempts at municipal sanitation were, by their nature, public projects. They acknowledged that waste was a citywide problem, not just a personal one. So, the social dynamics around medieval toilets were a mirror of medieval society itself. They showed the power and privilege of the wealthy, who could afford a degree of privacy, however limited. They showed the struggles and indignities faced by the poor, who had no such luxury. They showed the essential but often shunned role of those who handled society's waste. The public nature of medieval toilets, whether through communal use, direct street disposal, or the widespread effects of pollution, was deeply interwoven with social status. Your place in society often dictated your access to cleaner, more private, or at least less publicly visible means of relieving yourself. And conversely, the very public waste of a society revealed its underlying social structures and priorities. It was a constant, undeniable reminder of who held power and who bore the brunt of life's unpleasant necessities. It cemented the idea that in medieval times waste was a social, as much as a physical problem, affecting the well-being and dignity of all, though not equally.